of the assistant curators at Watts Gallery Artist Village, and I am the curator of our summer exhibition, A Fragmented Legacy, G.F. Watts and Sculpture, and I'm going to give you a sort of online version of that exhibition today. So I will just share my screen and I will get started. So the exhibition, Fragmented Legacy, G.F. Watts and Sculpture, is newly opened. Well, we've been open just over a month now at Watts Gallery, and we are open until the 2nd of October. And so I do hope if you are able to join us in person at Watts Gallery, look forward to seeing you there very soon. So the exhibition, for those of you that are unfamiliar with our spaces, it spans the entirety of our lower ground level in our historic galleries, and it coincides with a major redisplay and refresh, if you like, of our purpose-built sculpture gallery, which was originally built in 1907. And this exhibition is really a celebration of the sculpture collection that we have at Watts Gallery, and also the work of G.F. Watts as one of the Victorian period's leading painter sculptors. So George Frederic Watts is best known as a painter. He was the portraitist to the nation and the creator of large-scale symbolist pictures. However, from the 1860s until his death in 1904, he began to dedicate substantial amounts of time working on sculpture. This exhibition draws inspiration from the fascinating, if fragmentary, sculpture collection at Watts Gallery Artist Village, which was saved from the artist's London and Surrey studios following his death. And in this exhibition, we explore the full breadth of Watts's experimental, obsessive, and at times even destructive sculptural practice. So we open the show with this brilliant historic image of G.F. Watts up the scaffold working on his monumental statue to his friend Alfred Lord Tennyson, which we'll see more of later. And this is a really quite rare picture that we have of George actually at work on a piece of sculpture. We don't have any other images in our archive of him at work. So we really wanted to open the show with this brilliant image. The show begins then with a section called Early Years and Inspiration. So Watts' interest in sculpture began early. His youth was spent as an observer in the Soho-based studios of the prominent sculptor William Benz. Then, aged 18, we know that Watts enrolled at the schools of the Royal Academy of Art, where, although he didn't formally train in sculpture, he did have access to their extensive plaster cast collection. But despite these rich environments, Watts claimed that his greatest source of inspiration was Phidias, the ancient Greek sculptor best known for his work on the Parthenon in Athens. And here we have on display 3 commercial casts that were taken from the Parthenon sculptures, which are a group of architectural decorations from the Parthenon temple. They were removed from their sacred setting and subsequently sold to the British Museum in 1816. And it was during this time, as a result of that move, that Phidias and the Parthenon sculptures became a significant source of inspiration, artistic inspiration, in 19th century Britain. Parthenon sculptures are sometimes also referred to as the Parthenon marbles and previously referred to as the Elgin marbles, but Watts Gallery, we have taken the line to refer, when naming them, to refer to their original location rather than referring to the individual who removed them from that location. And we know that Watts spends hours upon hours in the British Museum in front of the Parthenon sculptures, which he referred to as the very best of beauty. And this is to give you just a close up, if you like, of these 3 casts that Watts purchased, and he had them on display in his various studios. And alongside them, we've exhibited some of those sketchbooks, some of these brilliantly small, they're actually smaller than they'll appear on the screen in real life, just showing the meticulous detail and the sketches that he was creating whilst he was sitting in front of the sculptures. And it was really quite difficult to narrow down which pages to show in the exhibition. We have 13 of Watts' sketchbooks in our archive, and the pages are just filled with these brilliant studies. So this is just a small selection for you to see. In addition to casts of classical sculpture, there was also a huge marketplace in really peaking in the mid-19th century of anatomical plaster casts as well. And these are just three that we have in the collection. We have over 100 different plaster casts, and these would have been collected by artists, by museums, and indeed by universities as objects to study. And for Watts, we know exhibiting alongside this drawing, which shows 14 different studies. For him, it was they were collected as sources of inspiration in which to study from. And if you think, they're basically a cheaper alternative than a life model. A life model, you obviously have to pay. They can't hold poses indefinitely, whereas your plaster cast, you're kind of frozen that moment in time. And he was really obsessed with depicting joints. You know, again, we've got pages and pages of elbow joints, shoulders, wrists, how the back twists. So this is a brilliant study that we have where there's 14 different angles, if you like, and he's really visualizing the human form in sculptural terms. These are just a few more examples of his early studies, and when working on this exhibition, it really helped me to appreciate Watts. As a draftsman, we rarely get to exhibit the works on paper due to, you know, the fragility of many of them, and just to preserve them for the future. They can't be on display for long periods of time. So it's brilliant that we've been able to bring these works out and to show that different side of Watts' artistic practice. We then move on to Medusa, and the head of Medusa is Watts' earliest sculptural design. It dates from around 1846 and was likely made during the young artist's extended stay in Florence, Italy during that year. It's not known how much of this sculpture, which is carved in alabaster, we don't know how much of it was actually carved by Watts himself. In her biography of her husband, Mary Watts suggests that assistants carried out the majority of the carving work, with, she quotes, the last chiseling done by Watts' own hand. The names of the assistants were not recorded, but it was fairly common practice in 19th century sculpture studios, with artists often designing and finishing a work, but leaving the highly detailed work, or the legwork, if you like, to assistants. So if we think, you know, a contemporary example, the likes of Damien Hirst has a whole factory of assistants creating his work. That was very much what it was like in 19th century sculpture studios also. The next section we come to in the exhibition is entitled Pencil, Pigment and Plaster. And in this section, we really explore that according to Watts, he very much believed that painting, sculpture and architecture should always work in unison, with the artist looking upon them as a single activity. He was disappointed, he often said, in the next generation of young artists who were in the habit of keeping exclusively to one branch. Now, although Watts never ventured into the world of architecture himself, he can be described as a painter sculptor. His artistic practice was extremely fluid. His paintings would influence his sculpture, and his sculpture would influence his paintings. And as displayed in this section, he tackles the same subject in different mediums, revealing his long-standing interest in sculpture as he continually uses two-dimensional surfaces to depict figures from multiple viewpoints, visualizing their three-dimensionality. And the example that I've shown here, which is one of my favorite paintings in the entire collection, this is the double portrait of Long Mary, Mary Bartley, to give her proper name. And she was the housemaid at Little Holland House when Watts lived and worked there. And her face, her image can be seen throughout Watts's career. He first paints her in the 1860s, and her likeness in a lot of the large scale symbolist pictures, and indeed in the sculptures. If we think of these large eyes, this quite thick nose, and these very plump lips, that's a very sort of recognizable face that we see time and time again. And this painting is particularly interesting because we really see that the focus of Watts's attention here is on the head, the face, and the hair, which has been brushed back to fully expose her features, whereas the background and her clothing appear as quite flat masses of colour, really showing their insignificance really in this head study. And he's depicting her from different viewpoints, really thinking of her in the round, but using this two-dimensional surface to expose his interest in the three-dimensional. In this section, we also look at Clytie, and Clytie, we have 4 versions of Clytie in Watts Gallery collection. So the 3 works of art you see on the wall there, and the bronze bust on that striking blue plinth we had. And to look at the study, so here just focusing in on the chalk study and the oil on panel, it's difficult to know exactly which order these works came in, particularly between the finished sculpture, the chalk, and the oil painting. The chalk study, we can see the face is almost completely hidden, and this lost profile, if you like, draws focus away from the face and towards the rest of the body. And it's this violent twist of the neck that Watts was most interested in. And with the coloured chalk here, he's really emphasising that violent twist and the strain of Clytie's body. Clytie in Greek mythology was the water nymph who fell in love with the sun god Helios. And it's quite a sad story, as most Greek myths are, a story of unrequited love. Helios did not return her affections, and so she was destined to watch his daily crossing over the sky with the rising sun. And following the sun, Clytie was transformed into a heliotrope flower, and it's this moment, normally depicted as a sunflower, as we see in this version, and it's this moment that Watts is depicting as she's transforming. The leaves are kind of enfolding around her as she turns into this flower. Now, the bronze version of Clytie that we have is perhaps Watts's best known sculpture. It's certainly a very popular piece with our visitors today, and it was the only sculpture that Watts exhibited during his lifetime. He exhibited an original marble, which was shown in 1867 at the Royal Academy. And although it was received with huge acclaim, Watts considered the work of art unfinished. And this is a common theme with Watts's both his sculptural work and his painting. He often submits things for exhibition, isn't entirely happy with them, and then spends sometimes 20 years refining it and at times overworking things. He didn't really know when to sort of quit a piece at times. And Mary, there's loads of references in Mary's diary and biography where she's just getting really quite annoyed with her husband that he just won't leave a piece alone. But this work was enthusiastically reviewed, and in 1894 the poet and the critic Edmund Goss hailed it as the precursor of the new sculpture movement. And Clytie was seen to be a rejection against late Victorian sculpture, which was often viewed as sentimental and romantic, with its reliance on stiff and stylized nudes inspired by classical subjects and models. So this was kind of a very much more vigorous depiction in marble, and this slightly later edition in bronze. And one of the most exciting parts of this show was the opportunity to unite Clytie with her original counterpart that Watts always intended, Daphne, which is this beautiful marble bust that we're fortunate enough to have on loan from Tate Britain. And Daphne, she dates slightly later, so Clytie was made between 1865 and 69. Daphne dates around 1879 to 82. And the marble bust was always intended to be a counterpart to Clytie, but Watts never finished it. And today, because of that, it is strikingly angular because of its unfinished state. Perhaps not hopefully clear on this image, but if you come and view it in person, it's really quite remarkable to see that you can still see the chisel marks, especially on her chest and on her neck. She appears quite modern in comparison to Clytie, and it's really interesting to just see an unfinished work, because you can really imagine for yourself what it may have turned into, what it may have looked like. Would it have looked very similar to Clytie if he had finished it? We just don't know. We then move on to the next section in the exhibition, which is called Fragments. Now, many of Watts's sculptural creations were actually temporary experiments. So rather than being finished works such as Clytie, these played a key role in Watts's artistic creative process. So the surviving three-dimensional studies in plaster, which we show in this section, helped Watts visualize complex compositions and the expressions of his figures, all whilst following the rules of anatomy. These models also reveal Watts's obsessive working methods, as he repeatedly returned and reimagined compositions over many years. And models of this type rarely survive and were usually destroyed by the artist. So this makes Watts Gallery Trust collection a really important and unique record that allows us to fully appreciate the work of Watts as a painter sculptor. And just showcasing here one of the models that we have of the male figure of Orpheus, and they're quite grotesque. We were worried that some of our younger audiences might find these slightly scary, but they're just brilliant records of the artist at work. You can really see where he's sort of, you know, putting the plaster together and really getting his thumbs in, working extremely quickly, which, if anything, gives these models more energy, makes them more dynamic. And to show you what I mean by the helping him inform his composition, I'll just go on to show you. This is one of the paintings we have of Orpheus and Eurydice. So he's really thinking about that twist of the body again, and the Orpheus throwing his arm around Eurydice. This is again a highly dramatic moment that he's depicting, where essentially in the myth Orpheus has essentially dropped an absolute clanger here. He's turned around, and because of that he's killed his wife Eurydice all over again. It was the one thing he was told not to do: don't turn around and look at her, and he did it. And so what's really brilliant here is this head study that we have, where it's that moment of deep regret, and almost like the moment you realize you've done something really quite stupid. But the sculpture, the head study that we have, actually tells us more than any of the final paintings. So the painting, this is just one version that we have. We have two others in the collection. The face is always quite obscured on the figure of Orpheus. So in this instance, the original model actually tells us more than the finished painting. One of the other models we have in this section is this brilliant life model of love and life, and the painting, the oil study of love and life here on the right hand side. This is a painting and a theme that Watts returned to over the course of his career. I think there's 11 different versions of love and life, one of which is currently on display at Tate Britain. And this is what's really referred to as his best composition. So, you know, he held it in a very high regard. And what's interesting about the model, and it's perhaps not entirely evident just looking at the picture, but it's actually split into parts. If you look at the base, there's that very definite line there. And the join, if you like, comes up to the wrist. Now that is purposeful. We haven't dropped it, we didn't break it. That is how Watts intended it. And what that really shows is what he's most interested in with this composition. And it's the moment that these two figures come together. So this is the male winged figure of love, tenderly guiding the female figure of life up the rocky mountainous path. And he's really thinking about at what angle should the head be turned up, at what point do the hands come together. And in this oil study, we can see that he still hasn't quite figured out what he wants to do with the hands. They're not finished to a high degree. They're still quite blurry. So again, just really fascinating insight into what it is that's driving Watts when he's painting and how he's using these sculptures to help that. The exhibition then continues through into our sculpture gallery. And as I mentioned at the start, this was purposefully built in 1907 to house the sculpture collection. So we've had a bit of a refresh, a bit of a reorganization and a re-display. And one of the things we've done is, for those of you who would have visited us at the start of the year or before that, is we've turned Tennyson for the very first time. So this is just to give you some behind the scenes look into what that job entailed. It was quite a terrifying thing to witness. These are our two brilliant art handlers here turning Tennyson. He used to essentially look at the rear end of a horse, and we thought, just to give him a nicer viewpoint, we'll have him looking out of the window for a bit. But we have loads of brilliant photos of Watts with Tennyson. This is to give you sort of a sense of the scale excuse me, of Tennyson. Watts working on him at a very high level on these scaffolds and these ladders. It's not known how much, again, of the work Watts was actually doing. So this image we have of him with his chisel and his hammer, this may have been a photo opportunity, really, rather than showing him doing the entirety of the piece. And Tennyson really celebrates Watts's later approach to sculpture. Between 1867 and 1883, Watts's approach completely changes. His once private pursuit enters the public realm, and he's commissioned to work on a number of commemorative statues, both for church memorials and public spaces. From 1883 onwards until the end of his lifetime in 1904, another change in Watts's process occurs as he begins to work on an increasingly colossal scale. And this is triggered by his choice to work in gesso grosso. A lot of our visitors think, I'll just take you back, that these are concrete or stone, but it's a mixture called gesso grosso, which is essentially a thick mixture of chalk, glue, and fibrous materials such as hemp or tow. So a very rough type of linen. If you think of old potato sacks, it's essentially that sort of material. And gesso grosso really works in a similar way when I'm trying to communicate to audiences as paper mache. So it's very, you can model it by hand like clay. When it's soft, it's very malleable, but once it's dry, it dries rock hard. And this gesso grosso mixture can then be chiseled and carved like stone, so it does have that appearance. And this versatile material really revolutionizes Watts's work as a sculptor, enabling him to embark on these much more ambitious projects. At this point in his life, his health is also failing him. And so whereas monumental statues like this would often be modeled in clay, that then enabled them to be cast in bronze. Clay, to work with it, you have to work in very damp conditions, very wet conditions. And that was really aggravating Watts's ill health and his rheumatism at this time. So this gesso grosso, working in this, really enabled him to keep continuing that work. And it also allowed him to develop much more obsessive ways of working. For the rest of his career, he would go through a relentless process, endlessly constructing, repositioning, and occasionally dismantling works altogether. And two such works are Monument to Lord Tennyson and the other sculpture that dominates the gallery, which I will go on to talk about in just a moment. And so here we can see this is a preparatory version of Tennyson's head. He hasn't been decapitated. But it's interesting to compare this to the larger full model, as the head here is very smooth and naturalistic, whereas in contrast to the final piece, Watts was more experimental and created a much more heavily textured surface. This is particularly evident across the forehead and the cheeks. Now, Watts began to work on Tennyson, just going back to these archival images, in 1898. And that is the year that the Great Barn Studio was bought near Limnesleigh, his home in Compton, which is now part of the Watts Gallery Village. And this provided Watts and his assistants with ample room in which to work. They would often wheel the sculpture out also, as you can see outside, so enabling Watts to view it from a distance and in an open space. Excuse me. Using this gesso grosso model, the piece was then cast in bronze, and the final version of it can be seen outside Lincoln Cathedral, where it is still there today. We then move on to the other monumental piece of sculpture that dominates the sculpture gallery, and this is physical energy. And it was the last piece of art that Watts worked on, literally up until his dying days. But he created it over a 20-year period, and he continued to revise, deconstruct, and rebuild the horse and rider during the course of its creation. In her diary, Mary Watts often referred to her husband's progress on the sculpture. In one entry, she's marveling at its energy and its power, but days later, she recorded that the rider was headless and had lost its arms. Then, after some more time had passed, she commented that the rider had a new head and a thickened torso, but what still felt like, quote, hacking it all to pieces. And this is just one of the historic photographs we have, where if you look, we can see that the front leg of the horse in this instance has been chopped off. And it's really interesting when you see the piece in person, you can see where some of these changes have been made. The lines are very visible, that evidence that he was changing his mind. And it's brilliant reading Mary's diary and accounts, because at times you can tell again she's just really fed up. She's just like, just settle on its pose and leave it alone. But during the artist's lifetime, and indeed after his death, this sculpture has taken on different meanings and connotations, the most problematic being that between Watts' physical energy and the businessman and imperialist Cecil Rhodes. So using this gesso grosso model, 4 bronze casts have been made throughout the last 140 years. The first was cast in 1902, and following the death of Cecil Rhodes, G.F. Watts was contacted by Lord Grey, who was the administrator of the British South Africa Company. And Watts and Rhodes had met in the late 1890s. Watts did paint Cecil Rhodes's portrait. He came to his house in London and he had several sittings. That portrait is now in the National Portrait Collection, the rest of the Hall of Fame pieces. And so following Rhodes's death, Watts is approached to ask if this sculpture, which Rhodes had admired during his sittings, he had seen physical energy out in the garden at Little Holland House. And because Rhodes had admired it so much, Lord Grey really thought it would be the best piece to be the frontispiece of a memorial to Cecil Rhodes. And Watts agreed to this. He quite enthusiastically agreed to this as well, saying that he really aligned this sculpture, which was once seen to be a universal symbol of human endeavour. He really saw it as aligning with Cecil Rhodes's characteristics and his values. So this version was cast in 1902 whilst Watts was still alive. It was exhibited in the courtyard of the Royal Academy of Arts in the summer of that year. Watts managed to see it exhibited in that space just before he died. It was then transported from London to South Africa, and it was installed here at the Cecil Rhodes, the purpose-built Cecil Rhodes Memorial in Cape Town, and it was installed there in 1912. Watts had always intended a version of physical energy to be left to the British nation, though, as his gift to the nation, and this was fulfilled several years after his death. This second version was installed in Kensington Gardens in 1907, where you can still see it today. It's sort of behind the Albert Memorial, if you like, if you just follow the path straight behind it. So you can see the second version of the bronze there. Then we fast forward slightly to the late 1950s. So in 1959, the British South Africa Company approached Watts Gallery Trust to ask if the gesso grosso model could be used to make a third cast for a second memorial to Cecil Rhodes. And on the left of the screen here, you can see that version was originally installed outside of the High Court in Lusaka. But then following Zambia gaining independence in 1964, calls were made for the statue to be removed. It was then relocated to what is now Zimbabwe. But then when Zimbabwe gained independence in 1981, it was removed again from a public space. And today, which is the picture on the right, this bronze is in the National Archives in Zimbabwe, in this landscape where it's surrounded by other dismantled colonial statues. We then fast forward to 2016, and Watts Gallery Trust commissioned a fourth version, a fourth bronze to be made to celebrate the bicentenary of Watts's birth. And it was exhibited, as the original first one was, in the same courtyard at the Royal Academy of Arts. And the location of this fourth bronze, whereabouts on the Watts Gallery Trust estate that should be installed, is subject to a public consultation that Watts Gallery is currently undergoing with our audiences and our communities. And so for the very first time, we've tried to tell this story openly, honestly, and clearly to our audiences, as is our responsibility as a cultural institution. And so we have that story exhibited alongside the model. I've also added a link there, which I can also put into the chat box later, where you can read that full story on our website also, if you can't come to visit us in person. Opposite that wall, we've then given visitors space to have their say, both on physical energy, but also the sculpture collection itself. So, you know, we ask a couple of questions. What does sculpture mean to you? How does sculpture make you feel? And it's been brilliant seeing the variety of visitor feedback that we have here from, you know, they see sculpture as something that's very important, that needs to be maintained in our public spaces. Others don't believe that certain sculptures have a place anymore. And it's just brilliant to see some of the younger audiences just taking a chance to do some sketching and leaving those records with us. But I'll just end to wrap things up, just giving you kind of a very brief whistle-stop tour, if you like, of the exhibition. It would be really lovely if you could all attend or come and visit us in person, really just scratch the surface of some of the stories that we have in the collection and some of the items we have on show. This is one of the historic cases to sort of intrigue you into coming and seeing what else we have, and really showcasing the breadth of the collection and really highlighting the sculpture collection with many of our paintings and works on paper. And this is just a background shot of our painting conservator's studio, Sally Marriott. She worked really hard to get a lot of these pieces just back up to, you know, a standard where we'd be happy to exhibit. This one piece, Mary Magdalene, she suffered from some really bad yellowing, varnish, and overpaint that wasn't original to Watts's time, so she stripped that all back. And, you know, just showcasing some of these brilliant paintings that we have in the collection alongside the sculpture has been a real joy to pull that all together for the exhibition. So I will end there, but thank you so much for all of your time and for listening. and I do hope to welcome you to Watts Gallery very soon in the future. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Stacey. That was a brilliant, like I say, whistle-stop tour of the current exhibition, with some real deeper dives there into some of those sort of unsavoury histories of some of the objects. And it's so brilliant to see that Watts been so transparent about that and doing so much to have that public consultation with how we reinterpret these statues and these objects that reflect issues of colonialism in our past. So huge congratulations with that project. I was going to ask if anybody had any questions for Stacey. If anybody wanted to put those in the chat box and I can ask those to her, that would be fab.
Yeah, and I've just popped that link in, so if anyone wants to go to the website, and I'm sorry that my throat seems to be giving up on me.
It's a hot day and a long talk. Don't worry about it. Whilst we're waiting to see if anybody else has a question, Stacey, I've got one for you, which is, what was your favourite object that you discovered or found out something about from the sculpture collection whilst you're putting the exhibition together?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if I have just one. I think what's been great is actually getting a lot of the pieces out. So as part of the sculpture gallery refit, we had to decant the whole collection. So it was kind of really seeing what we had. The historic cases in there, they weren't always clear what was in there. The glass was, really dark. The interiors were really dark. So we've
it always looked a bit like an antique shop, didn't it?
Yeah. So just getting some pieces out. We've got a plaster cast, which is a bit disgusting, to be honest. It's 2 ears, but you can see like one of the ears was quite hairy when it was cast, and so it's like that level of detail. And we've got about 10 left feet, and just getting those details, and seeing in some of the historic photos where Watts was displaying them in his studio is brilliant. We'd really like to get a sort of trail with our younger audience, where you then have to go and identify, where is this ear, which painting, is it in. So just, getting up close with a lot of the pieces that normally we wouldn't have was really brilliant whilst putting the show together. And just really hard trying to think, what, there was so much to choose from, especially the works on paper. We could have had a show all of, his studies, and they're brilliant. And I think sometimes you don't see that side of Watts in his paintings. Yeah, too many to pick from.
No, it's wonderful to hear that we discovered so much more about that collection from doing the research. So thank you for that. I can't see any other questions. Oh, one from Jerry, just in the nick of time. Jerry says he saw the exhibition last week and wants to know if the new display cabinets in the statue gallery will remain, or is that part of the display only for the exhibition?
No, so those cases in the sculpture gallery, they will remain. They were there originally. So the story is that they weren't original to the 1907 version of the gallery. They've actually come from Kew Gardens. They were rescued about, it was when Watts Gallery underwent the renovation, so it's over 10 years ago now. One of our volunteers heard about them. I think they used to display seeds. So they were never really intended for sculpture, but we glazed them, repainted them, and we put lighting in them for the very first time. So you can actually see what's in them now, but those cabinets, they will remain in there. The display may change slightly when the exhibition closes, because then we've got to kind of, if you think, suck all that material back in to the case. So following the exhibition closing on the 2nd of October, there'll be a new display in those cabinets.
Do an exhibition just of exhibition display cabinets.
They're everyone keeps thinking they're brand new, but it's just a lick of paint and some lighting.
It's amazing what a lick of paint will do.
Exactly.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much, Stacey, like I said, for going through all of the details about the exhibition and for telling us more about Watts' sculpture. It's definitely a fascinating part of his career and something we don't think about very often. So it's been brilliant to have the light shone on that. Thank you. This recording will go onto YouTube, so I'll try and get that up sometime next week. So if anybody wants to watch it back, then that's where it will be. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Stacey.
Thank you.
Thank you.